Tonight, I'm really happy to sit down and have a conversation about one of the most revolutionary ideas of the 20th century. And when I say revolutionary, I mean it's on the scale of the Copernican revolution, in which slowly people began to realize that the sun does not revolve around the earth, and sort of a displacement of the hubris of the earth as the center of the universe. In the same way, the concept and the idea of the unconscious displaces the ego as the center of the psyche. And that revolution has led to our modern way of thinking. So much so, you might say, even nowadays, there are two kinds of people. There are people who are not aware of their unconscious, and there are people who are aware of their own unconscious. And in psychoanalysis, we call that psychological mindedness, the ability for sort of self-reflection, the ability to start to see things about yourself that are not self-evident. That's the concept of the unconscious. I mean, first of all, to have a conversation about the unconscious, we have to realize that we have a bit of a logical dilemma, because to talk about something implies that you're conscious of it. So how can we talk about the unconscious consciously? That's a dilemma. How can we know about the unconscious consciously? Because by definition, when we know it, it's conscious, it's no longer unconscious.
The research comes to the question of the unconscious. There, things become necessarily blurred, because the unconscious is something which is really unconscious. So you have no object, you see nothing. No. You only can make inferences, you know. And so we have to create a model of this possible structure of the unconscious.
That's a paradox, and it goes right back, actually, to Greek philosophy, because it's discussed already in Plato. Plato in his Meno dialogues, so now we're talking about the 5th century in Athens. In the Meno dialogues, Plato presents Socrates having a debate with a sophist whose name is Meno. Meno, somewhat trying to trap Socrates, asked him this famous question, which is called Meno's paradox, or the learner's paradox. And how will you inquire, Socrates, into that which you do not know? What will you put forth as the subject of inquiry? And if you find what you want, how will you ever know that this is the thing which you did not know? Later on, we're going to have to come back to the surprising answer that Plato puts in the mouth of Socrates about the origin of virtue. For instance, I want you to think about what is the most valuable thing in the world. And typically people say oil, right? They say, oil. I think the present market value that I saw was $2.5 trillion worth of oil in the world. And the oil companies are spending $41 billion in exploration and in developing oil. That's not the biggest thing. There is another thing that has a market value, they're saying, of $3 trillion. And even just to this year, it's growing exponentially. Companies have spent more than $200 billion on developing this product. What is that product? And the answer is big data. Big data has more commercial value than oil and more is spent by far to develop big data. What does that have to do with the unconscious? Well, why are companies spending $200 billion to mine and use algorithms and extract the kind of information you can extract from big data? Why are they doing that? And the simple answer is they're doing that to influence you and me and everybody else. The value of big data is the value to take that data and motivate people to do something. So we would say advertising, right? The value of Facebook is that Facebook is using all your information. Somebody called it the world's greatest waste of technology for the simple purpose of created targeted advertising. Big data is all about influencing you to do something, influencing people's behavior. And where the unconscious comes in, it's like, are you aware you are being influenced? For instance, a friend was telling me their daughter has an iPhone. She and her friend were sitting at a table outside during pandemic times, having a conversation, and she was discussing that she needed a dog crate for her dog and was thinking about a specific kind. And then she went home after that meal, and on her Facebook, a half an hour after the meal, ads for this particular dog crate began to appear in her feed. She did not have her phone on, but the ads began to appear to influence her to unconsciously to buy this dog crate. That's the power of influence. And when we talk about influence, I have to tell you the story of Edward Bernays. Edward Bernays is one of those names that I think, unless you're in the field, certain fields, we'll get to that in a minute, you probably don't know who Edward Bernays is. He was born in 1891 and he died in 1995 at the ripe old age of 103. And one thing that's interesting about Edward Bernays is that he was the nephew of Sigmund Freud. And he was a double nephew because of this strange arrangement where Freud's sister was his mother. That makes him a nephew. His father, Bernays' father, the Bernays in this, was the brother of Freud's wife, making him the nephew. But it also means, what's interesting, is that Freud married Martha Bernays, and her brother married Freud's sister. That's pretty close. There's a whole anthropological thing called the cross-cousin marriage, and that's getting to that part. At any rate, the Bernayses left Austria, and Edward Bernays ended up in New York. He was into the promotion business, and when he was very young, he worked a little bit promoting Caruso to make him, the most famous Italian tenor in the world at a very young age, so that by age 26, as the United States entered into World War I, a committee was formed to influence American opinion, right? The Committee on Public Information for World War I in America. By participating in that, then Bernays was invited by Wilson to go to the Paris Peace Conference for World War I. And he, in 1919 and 1920, and Bernays got into trouble a little bit, talking about the importance of creating propaganda to highlight the American influence and participation in the war. And Bernays never forgot that. He said the Germans, as in World War I, had ruined the term propaganda, and he was going to have to do something else. So here's Bernays. He comes back from the peace conference and thinks that he needs another term for propaganda, and the word he comes up with, and then creates a company doing that, is called public relations. What he's most famous for, and this is what I want to talk to you about unconscious influence, right, is that a man named George Washington Hill, the president of the American Tobacco Company, Lucky Strike cigarettes, in 1927 into 1928, begins to realize that only 5% of women are smoking cigarettes. Cigarettes had only been for women of lower class and hookers and things like that. And in the movies, that's how they were portrayed. The movie used a woman smoking a cigarette as a clue that she was a woman like that. So the the American Tobacco Company wanted to open a new market, and they asked Edward Bernays if he could come up with a campaign to convince women to smoke in 1928. What does Bernays do? He's in New York City. Uncle Ziggy does not help him. He goes to the most prominent American psychoanalyst in New York, which is Abraham Brill. Brill's a whole other story that we may talk about further down in this journey. And he says to Brill, I have this thing, I need to convince women to smoke. Brill gives the classical Freudian interpretation and says that obviously a cigarette is a penis. Women want a penis. They lack a penis, so they have penis envy. They want it. So really, to get women to smoke more, all a campaign has to do is to put those two things together, right? Make a woman feel powerful because she has a penis that looks like a cigarette. That's called displacement, to displace a disturbing idea in the Freudian terms with an acceptable idea. So where's the acceptable idea? Brill explains to Bernays that, well, you know, we could call them torches because a cigarette is like a torch. Torches of freedom, as a matter of fact. A cigarette is a torch of freedom for a woman. And Bernays, being the father of public relations, says, I know just what to do. So, coming into the spring of 1929, I guess what we'd call it today is that Bernays arranges to photobomb the Easter parade in New York City, in the sense of that he hires 40, 50 women, and he said that they should be good looking without looking like models because they're going to be an example. And right in the middle of the parade on Broadway, at his command, in a certain flash, all these women flop out their cigarettes and start smoking in public in the Easter parade, a thing that had not been heard of. Bernays had his own photographers to get the classic shots of all these things happening and made sure that those shots, shocking, got in the papers. And within 1 year, the percentage of women smoking went from 5% to 12%. And in 3 years to 18%. And it continued on into the 1960s where the percentage of women who smoked cigarettes was about 33%. Unconscious influence. Here's a quote from Edward Bernays that you might want to think about, right? The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinion of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our taste formed, our ideas suggested largely by men we have never heard of. In almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct or our ethical thinking, we are dominated by the relatively small number of persons who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind. So I just want to think about this a little bit differently, right? I mean, come on. The example of cigarettes, evil cigarettes, influenced by propaganda. I guess we'd like to think that what we used to call, I mean, it's Freudian bullshit, right? Women are not having penis envy, don't think of everything as a penis. I mean, come on, that's all been debunked at this point. That's not what made this campaign work. But there's still this factor of unconscious influence. So what do we say? Maybe, let's just have a fantasy. People back then had less media savvy, so they were more vulnerable to being influenced by magazines and, pictures of women smoking in magazines, and they were less sophisticated, and we wouldn't fall for that kind of thing, right? I'll give you another example. There's a television show that you may have heard of about advertising, now moved up into the 1960s, called Mad Men. Because it's the same thing. There's a famous scene where Don Draper is asked to come up with a campaign to promote a certain lipstick company. And their previous campaign, which is flopping, has to do with they have a gazillion colors of lipstick. And that's why a woman should buy their lipstick, because they have all these colors. It's not working. There's this famous scene in Mad Men where then Don Draper begins to talk and says, no, what it's about is that a woman needs to feel that she marks her man with her unique individual lipstick.
Every woman wants choices, but in the end, none wants to be one of 100 in a box. She's unique. She makes the choices, and she's chosen him. She wants to tell the world he's mine. He belongs to me, not you. She marks her man with her lips. He is her possession. You've given every girl that wears your lipstick the gift of total ownership.
So what are we really talking about here? We're talking about the idea of unconscious influence and trying to find a way to convince ourselves, or I'm using it as sort of a rhetorical argument, to convince ourselves that it doesn't work, right? Something like a Don Draper. And the question is, so why is big data spending $200 billion to have even more sophisticated, targeted advertising to you as they know you from all of your habits and behaviors? If it doesn't work, Why spend $200 billion? Just to continue the argument a little bit more, let's say that you're a very conscious person, right? I'm a conscious person, or I like to think of myself in that way. And so what do we say? Your Jedi mind tricks will not work on me. I wouldn't fall for a Jedi mind trick. To be motivated to do something I have not chosen consciously to do. Right? Like, I would never buy a Lincoln just because of Matthew McConaughey. I like Matthew McConaughey. I like his films. The commercials are amazing in the acting that he can do without talking, just the way he looks, what he does with his eyes. It's amazing. Does that influence me to want to buy a Lincoln? I like to think that I'm not influenced in that way. Maybe I am, maybe I'm not. But I guess the telltale sign is going to be the degree in which I am conscious enough to see through the Jedi mind trick. I'll give you another example. What about anesthesia? Right? Anesthesia makes a person unconscious. I don't know if you've ever been under anesthesia. It's very different than sleep. It's not that the anesthesia puts you to sleep, because at least my experience when I'm asleep, going through the 4 stages of the sleep cycle and even the deep sleep, the delta waves, the slow rolling brain pattern, when I'm asleep, I'm still having mental activity, right? I have dreams, I have other experiences, and when I wake from being asleep, I'm aware of the passage of time. When you're under anesthesia, at least for me, the experience is blink. Right? It's that I'm in the OR, the anesthesiologist is counting backwards, and then blink. I'm in the recovery room and somebody is asking me to wake up. That's a different kind of unconscious, I would say. And then we have to add the caveat that, of course, there are people who report that maybe they didn't get enough anesthesia. They experienced their entire operation, but they were paralyzed, couldn't move, couldn't talk, and they were not unconscious. They were unconscious through the operation. Question that I want you to think about is, have you ever considered how anesthesia works? How does anesthesia make someone unconscious? And the answer is the biological mechanism in the brain. Nobody knows. Nobody knows how anesthetic makes a person unconscious. Not even the anesthesiologist knows the actual mechanism. Because how do you make a person unconscious? I was just reading the other day, there's been new research this year, 3 different papers. And one of the papers is saying, yes, it has something to do with the SNARE, S-N-A-R-E proteins. They're disabled by the anesthetic. Another paper was saying, well, actually, it's the supraoptic nucleus. They are shut down by the anesthetic. And the other paper was saying, no, it's actually in the synapses that this happens. And so, I mean, there you go. We still don't know. I'll give you another example. What about hypnosis, right? The idea in hypnosis is that a person can be given an unconscious suggestion. And the person does not know that they're being hypnotized, unless that is part of the hypnotic command. So it's a long history with hypnotism. I mean, we know it sort of colloquially more as a thing in a comedy club, or you see on TV, right? That someone is given the suggestion that they act like a chicken, or that they have sexual impulses on stage. And the whole gig, right, is how much fun it is for the audience to know what is going on, but the person on stage is unconscious of the suggestion they have been given. Now, I mean, you can think about that. We generally think of hypnosis as going back to Anton Mesmer, hence mesmerizing, from Mesmer. And he lived from 1734 to 1815. You may not know, for instance, that hypnotism was so popular it was used as an anesthetic in the Civil War battle hospitals. And it worked. Hypnotism as an anesthetic. The more modern history of hypnosis goes back to Jean-Martin Charcot in Paris, sort of in the middle of the 1800s now, and the famous demonstrations that he gave in which all the doctors would sit around and Charcot, with the patient down in the theater, would hypnotize the patient, and there would be miracle cures and all kind of things would happen. What's interesting, and the direct connection, is that Sigmund Freud, when he was a young man, went to Paris to study with Charcot. He was enamored of the technique. He writes to his wife about a party at Charcot's large house. He was so enamored, in fact, of Charcot that he named his son Martin after Jean-Martin Charcot. And when he went back to Vienna, he began practicing hypnosis, which he gave up later because of sort of incomplete and unpredictable results. The story moves ahead now with Pierre Janet. He comes after Charcot. He's about the same age as Freud. And what's interesting about Janet is that as a young man, Carl Jung, again, that age difference, bit younger than Freud, goes to Paris when he is a young man to study with Pierre Janet. So both Freud and Jung began with this experience in Paris and came back trying hypnosis, and both very soon gave up hypnosis as the technique. So Janet's take then on hypnotism was to come up with a psychological concept of dissociation, that the reason a person can be hypnotized is that they are induced into a dissociative state. Both Freud and Jung picked up the idea of dissociation from Janet. And that's a whole nother take on it, right? Because we all have dissociative states sometimes. It's as simple as the lack of attention. Or if you want to think about it, distracted driving, right? You get into the music, you're thinking about something, and you could drive 30 miles and not remember how you got there, what you did, what the drive was like, because you were not conscious of what you were doing. You were unconscious. You were in a dissociative state, mildly dissociative state. The extreme example, of course, is what we call dissociative identity disorder. Used to be called multiple personality disorder. And even though it's been in movies and all the things you see, it's a fairly rare condition. But the dissociation is so profound in dissociative identity disorder that different personalities who are not aware of each other appear in the patient, that the dissociation is so profound, there's a blackout. One personality is not even aware of the other personality or what that personality does. Like, why do I have these charges on my bank card? Well, because you were in the alter, you were in the other personality. It's also related to fugue state, another sort of dissociative condition in which a person has a blackout, sometimes lasting for days, and they don't know where they were or what they did. So, if hypnotism is dissociation, what is this mechanism of the unconscious, right? This unconscious influence. Now, again, you may say that you couldn't be fooled by the Jedi mind trick of hypnotism. You couldn't be hypnotized. Well, we'd have to find out about that, right? I mean, for instance, there's various tests of the suggestibility. Some people in the research are more suggestible than other people. And maybe you'd like to think, well, I'm one of those people who's really not very suggestible. One of the ways to find out is the so-called eye roll test. I'm not going to demonstrate it for you because it would be kind of gross, because the eye roll test involves seeing how far back in your head you can roll your eyeballs. As a matter of fact, I seem to be very good at that. I can roll my eyes way back in my eyeballs, and that suggests that I have a high degree of suggestibility. And I like to think that I'm a psychoanalyst. I would know if I was being given an unconscious suggestion and that I could stop it, right? I mean, I would know. And the answer is, well, maybe, and maybe not. So these examples of the unconscious, just to get started, take the unconscious in a negative or a pejorative sense, right? That to have an unconscious is to have a vulnerability. And you could say, in a way, that's derived from a more Freudian notion of the unconscious, which we're going to have to talk about later, the so-called id. But maybe the unconscious is only negative from a certain perspective, let's say from the perspective of the ego and ego functioning, but it's not necessarily negative from other perspectives. And we'll talk about this as we go along, but for instance, we all begin life in an unconscious state. Again, we are going to have to define conscious and unconscious.
Everything of which I know, but of which I'm not at the moment thinking. Everything of which I was once conscious, but have now forgotten. Everything perceived by my senses, but not noted by my conscious mind. Everything which involuntarily and without paying attention to it, I feel, think, remember, want, and do. All future things that are taking shape in me, and will sometime come to consciousness. All this is the content of the unconscious.
I really don't want to give you the wrong idea about the unconscious because of the sort of negative consequences or pejorative thoughts that we've used. You know, the unconscious is something that interferes. The unconscious is something that can make people sick, because it's not that way at all. I mean, the other aspect, we have to think of all these other things that come from the unconscious, of which, you know, dreams seem to be a very important aspect. And yes, dreams are going to require an entire episode to talk about dreams. But for instance, we can talk about famous dreams that have solved problems in the world, right? For instance, you might not know that James Watson one of the co-discoverers of DNA. Watson and Crick were stooped by trying to find the structure of DNA, and James Watson had a dream one night, the famous dream of a double staircase. And waking up from that dream, he realized that the structure of DNA was a double helix, like a double staircase. Another dream that's kind of famous has to do with Niels Bohr, who is given credit for the modern sort of picture of the structure of the atom. He had a dream in which he saw the arrangement of electrons, neutrons, protons, and out of that dream he knew that he had found his structure. Another example I can think of is Dmitry Mendeleev, who was the creator of the periodic table of chemicals. He had a dream in which he saw the periodic table, and he wrote that from what he put in the dream, he only had to make a few corrections in waking life, because the entire, again, structure of how it all went together came to him in a dream. And finally, we could say Friedrich Kuckeley had a famous dream of the snake eating its own tail, the so-called Ouroboros symbol, that helped him see the structure of the benzene ring. So these people are Nobel Prize winners, and their problem solving came in dreams, or in other words, from the unconscious. There are a lot of famous books that began as a dream. Mary Shelley had a dream in which Frankenstein appeared, and that was the basis of her novel. Same thing. You've heard of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a depiction of conscious and unconscious itself. And Robert Louis Stevenson had that in a dream. And finally, other artistic projects come in dreams. You've probably heard the song Yesterday by the Beatles. Paul McCartney got the melody and the opening sentence in a dream. It came to him. He wrote it down upon waking, went back to sleep, and then when he woke up, he couldn't believe what he had written down. If you don't like the Beatles, you might be a Stones person. Can't get no satisfaction. Same thing. Keith Richards had that in a dream. One night, wrote some things down. When he woke up in the morning, he had the song. The unconscious is creative and inspiring. Things that we can't quite get a hold of are there, just not quite conscious until we get a little help and bring out this creative aspect. I'll give you another example of helpful things in the unconscious. What about intuition? We kind of take intuition for granted, and then we say, there's no psi, there's no mind reading. Doesn't have to be that. Intuition is, I think, an aspect of that other part of our brain, that part of our unconscious, which is working on many different channels that of perception, that it's almost impossible for the ego to be conscious of all those channels at the same time. I don't know if you've had intuitive experiences. I could list, some famous things that have happened, like, Swedenborg's dream of the burning in Stockholm, things like that. But I ask you to really think about your own experiences of intuition. And that's the unconscious. All I can do is share an experience I had a long time ago when I was a minister in a church, and we had a thing where people would come off the street to ask for food. We had a food pantry. And I would just be sitting in my office, and people would come, and I would take them. They would get food. So this one time, this guy comes, he asks for food, and I did my usual thing. I left my office, and in walking down the hall, when I turned my back to him, I had just a gut intuition feeling that this was really dangerous and I shouldn't turn my back to him. Just a powerful, sort of overwhelming yelling from somewhere deep within me that things were dangerous. And we went around to the door to the food pantry. I opened the door, went in the food pantry. He came in behind me. And then I guess you call it a panic attack. Basically, is that he was between me and the door. And again, something was screaming. It was a really dangerous situation. Now, I have to say that I was so defended, so ego-bound, that at that time, I completely ignored what my intuition was telling me. I didn't do anything about it. And in this case, I was lucky because we get in the food pantry and he says, I really don't want food. And there's the chill in the spine. I need something to sell. And then he sort of looks around and there was a radio on the shelf, sort of, boombox type of thing. And he says, I'm going to take that. And he took it and hightailed it out the door, back out on the street. And then I look out my office window and he's at the traffic light where cars are stopped. And he's going from car to car holding up this radio, trying to get $20 for his meth or his coke or whatever was popular at that time. Now, I mean, this is two kinds of unconscious, right? You could ask, how could I be so oblivious that I couldn't tell he was high and he was jonesing for whatever he was jonesing for, and that it was dangerous. Even though my intuition, my unconscious, was telling me exactly what was going on. And the answer is, I was so cut off from that I couldn't take in that kind of intuitive information. But I would today. Okay. One way to think about intuition is as pattern recognition. Anthropologists and other researchers have found that, the human brain, human beings, are a pattern recognition machine. We will see patterns where there are no patterns, much less unconsciously perceive patterns that exist long before we're able to articulate what it is that we are intuiting. So that pattern recognition is important in that it remains unconscious, and sometimes it can take hours, days, weeks to realize that we have had a perception of a pattern in life, in nature, everywhere you care to look, we have those patterns.
We are born into a pattern. We are a pattern. We are a structure that is pre-established through the genes. It is a biological order of our mental functioning. As for instance, our biological or physiological function follows a pattern. Or the behavior of any bird or insect follows a pattern, and that is the same with us. Man has a certain pattern that makes him specifically human, and no man is born without it. We are only deeply unconscious of these facts because we live all by our senses and outside of ourselves. If a man could look into himself, he would discover it.
Okay, so we've talked about the unconscious in a variety of ways, including the sort of pejorative way. The unconscious is something that interferes with consciousness. We have talked about the unconscious as creative and providing inspiration in dreams and in intuition that we just talked about. Now I want to go back really to the original question that we began this hour, which is how best to understand the unconscious. And for me, that means a metaphor. I'm into metaphors. Metaphors help me comprehend something, the whole of something, instead of just the parts, to put it together. I want to leave you with what is the best way to really think about the unconscious and its influence in our lives. Different people have suggested different metaphors. There's the computer metaphor. If you know anything about computers, then you know what your GUI system is, your graphical user interface. I'm old enough that I remember DOS. I can't say I know DOS anymore. I've forgotten all the commands. But I used to be able to manipulate a Microsoft computer in DOS. And so it was a miracle when I got one of the first Macintoshes, which had a graphical user interface. And the answer was that you could get the computer to do things without typing in commands. You just click and it happens. That's a little bit like DOS is the unconscious part, a series of commands. Okay, it's a little bit of a dry metaphor. Another metaphor that is sometimes used is the metaphor of the brain. And that would be neuroscience is in particular very invested in getting us to, there is no unconscious, there's just the functioning of the brain. But the metaphor in there is, as I often tell my patients, when you think about the brain, there is no brain. I say that's like telling your car mechanic that, there's something wrong with my car. And the mechanic says, I have no idea what you're talking about. Do you mean the electrical system, the braking system? All the systems are what's important. And the brain is the same way. The brain is not a brain per se. The brain is at least 12 different organs functioning independently because of evolution. That's the miracle and the problem of evolution is that it doesn't take the old away. It just layers the new things that evolve one on top of the other, like a legacy system computer that still has software from the 1960s, and no one is alive who knows how that works anymore. So the brain has these different organs with competing agendas and functions, right? I mean, you can talk about the amygdala, you can talk about the hypothalamus, you can talk about the hippocampus, much less the cerebral cortex. So what I tell my patients is that the miracle of the brain is not really that sometimes something goes wrong with the brain. The miracle is that it works at all with all these different parts working independently. But the central metaphor and the most useful, I think, is the one that is simple and most obvious right in front of us all the time. And that is the idea that the unconscious never really goes anywhere. And it's a little bit this idea of opposites, that it's not as if we're conscious and then there is no unconscious. The unconscious is there all the time. So the metaphor for me is actually the very same metaphor in that we have the idea of night and day as opposites. spoiler alert, there actually is no night and day. That is a completely geocentric perspective. Ask any astronaut and you will see there's not night and day. There is the reality of space and the shining stars that are there all the time. We only perceive night and day because of the rotation of the earth as we make our turn into the brightness of the sun, which blocks out the stars. But the stars haven't actually gone anywhere. The stars remain even when the bright light of consciousness makes it seem as if we live in a daylight world. But we actually live in the universe. We actually live in space. So an image that Carl Jung picked up is the Latin word the scintille, from which we get our words scintillate. And actually, technically, scintillate refers to an astronomical phenomenon called scintillation of stars. We would call it the twinkling of stars. And again, the answer is stars don't actually twinkle. The scintillation is a result of changes in the atmosphere and all the filters we have to look through just to see the stars. When you're in space, stars don't actually twinkle. So the scintilla is an image that Carl Jung picks up from The Alchemist because he thought they were talking about the unconscious. And the scintilla refer to stars. You've heard of the scintilla. It appears in movies. It appears in common phrases that people use. This phrase, we're 1,000 points of light. That's an image of the scintilla. The scintilla are the lights on the Christmas tree. The menorah shining in the dark with a light that never goes out. The scintilla are the beautiful candles of the Diwali festival floating in the Ganges River. The scintilla are as simple as the lighters that people strike in a concert in the dark to create a sea of shining stars. There's a reference there and an idea that the scintilla present the possibility of making us relativize to our nice little planet Earth and shining in the vastness of the universe are other consciousnesses, that the ego complex is one complex among a multitude. And that gives me hope, and that gives me comfort. In the same way, the idea that our little planet is not alone in the universe, and that in the darkest night, the stars still shine. So that's the way to think of the unconscious, that the unconscious is the mother. I really love that image in Egyptian mythology of Mother Nut leaning over the whole world. And so she is the universe out of which we emerge. And when I say that that's simple and it's obvious, what I mean is that we literally emerge out of the unconscious as children. Ego consciousness, it appears in the research that the ego doesn't really form till about age 12. From 6 to 12, there are these steps along the way, and you begin to see that in a child. And prior to age 6, you can see that in your memories. It's really only islands of consciousness from time to time, for it to be consolidated, takes a long time. And then, of course, we descend back into that from which we came, the unconscious. In the end, we become unconscious again, like a child. It's also the opposites of sleeping and waking, because we do that every night. We wake and we're completely aware of this other world of unconscious. And yet then we sleep, and it appears as if the unconscious returns, but it's really only the bright light of ego consciousness that has created this experience of the background of our personalities seeming to disappear. And then it returns. So I want to leave that with you as a way to think about our original question as to why should one study the unconscious or learn anything about it? And I would say in our extroverted world, of course, all the energy and the money flows into the science of looking to the outer world. But the inner world is just as vast and stretches billions and billions of light years, as Carl Sagan liked to say, within us. And to understand that is to understand who we are and where we come from. That's what I want to talk about.